Alright, so I decided to make video series about Aristotle's Metaphysics, where I will go through chapter by chapter, analyzing the text. So the reason why I chose Aristotle's Metaphysics is twofold. Well, the first is that this is the book that basically lays out the backbone, the map, or the scheme of what Austrian philosopher Jean Gebser calls mental consciousness structure. That is the philosophical consciousness structure of Western civilization. What he calls a triangular abstract thought, where this type of thinking is directed, pointy, acute, methodical, and abstracted from everyday contextual nexus. And what Aristotle does in metaphysics is to establish the groundwork of such consciousness structure, of such type of thinking, where basically he's going to answer the question, what is philosophy? That is, the philosophy's metaphysics. But by that, he also establishes what I call an introtype of a contemplative thinker. An introtype is a term that I use to describe a particular psychobiological unit which is characterized by a form of civilizational temperament. And what Aristotle does in this book is that he establishes the ground rules for what it takes to have a contemplative, abstract, philosophical thinker. Now, there are a couple of introductory notes that you have to take before diving through the text. Well, the first thing is that we all know that generally philosophy began in ancient Greece, and as Jean Gebser points it out, it happened by the emergence of new type of consciousness structure, which was characterized by pyramidal thinking. A pyramidal thinking is a type of thinking where you are proceeding by the principle of deduction, whereby going from the universal to particulars is understood as the most reliable mode of thought. But what's important here, according to Jean Gebser, is that we have a new understanding of what constitutes a concept, of what constitutes a thing. So, if in the mythic consciousness structure, in the poetic mode of being, which Plato vehemently criticizes and he wants to banish all the poets from his republic, and so a consciousness structure was more loose and associative, now we get what I call a pocketed thinking, a categorical thinking, where we get abstract species, some form of ancestor to set theory, whereby now man is an abstract pocket, a form of a room which contains in its set all particular people such as Socrates, Aristotle, and so on and so forth. And what's important here is that fixing those abstract categories, those abstract universals, and making them self-identical, that is, preventing them from changing their definition, which is what poets and shamans and magic thinkers and sophists and political agitators do. They're establishing the groundworks for the ground rules for producing proofs and producing universal knowledge, and producing, as we're going to see, producing or apprehending universal knowledge is what defines metaphysics proper. Along with knowing the first causes, since, as we're going to see, metaphysics is the science of the first principles, the science of because as opposed to that. Now, another thing that we are going to look at in Aristotle's Metaphysics is the establishment of what is generally called classical laws of logic. Now, it's very important that the word logic comes from logos, and logos means word. Now, in ancient Greece, logos had many other connotations, but we have a more distilled and Christianized version of logos. However, in this case, it's pretty appropriate because logic is a science or a discipline or a system of words. How to have correct and valid reasoning. Reasoning which happens through concepts and words, right? So what Aristotle wants is to produce universal knowledges, right? And in order for you to produce universal knowledge, what you need to do is you need to defend yourself from sophistry and from poetry. And this is what he will be doing in Metaphysics, defending yourself from chance, from contingency. And we have three laws of logic, which comes from Aristotle's formulation, the law of identity, non-contradiction, and excluded middle. And as we're going to see, those laws had a very particular purpose in ancient Greece, namely to fix and freeze concepts, whereby they would not anymore be amiable to loose associative thinking, where, for example, in a shamanistic ritual, an individual tribesman can become a part of a god, where, for example, Vishnu can boast by presence, being in different times at the same time in the same sense. So what we are going to have here is the production of this strict, abstract, and segmented consciousness structure, a type of consciousness structure that a neo-spiritualist would try to escape by experimenting with LSDs and mushrooms and yoga and meditation and all sorts of things. Now, without further ado, let's jump into the text. Now, Aristotle commences by saying that all men by nature long to know. And, the first sentence is already so thick that we need to unpack it. So basically he begins, and this is a form of, a quasi-Straussian reading, but you should always, especially when reading a Greek text, you should always concentrate on how a philosopher opens up his text. What are the first words? What is the first word? What is the last word? Because it has its symbolic and non-symbolic meaning. And the first word, which would not be the first one in original Greek, but here we got, by nature, all men long to know. So he already establishes the tone, the temperament, the style. So we have got a form of abstract, all men, not particular, not Celius, not Socrates, not Plato, all men, and generalized, an abstract general knowledge, making a claim, and making an inherent, essential claim about species. And species not in the case of Homo sapiens, but species in the case of universals, right? All men long to know, an inherent faculty of men. And what is important here is that you should realize that this is not something that has been around for a long time, this form of universal knowledge whereby you abstract out a universal category from concrete particulars and then ascribe essential properties to it. And then we're going to understand what is it that the principle of identity actually means, because in modern day world, people really speak about those laws of logic, but they don't know what they actually do. The principle of identity is an identity that fixes an abstract genera with its essence, namely equating men with their essential properties. That's what the principle of identity does. And if you want to make universal abstract statements about abstract genera, so for example, all men have hearts, in order for you to prove that, you need a principle of identity, because all men have hearts if and only if man is a man. And what does it mean for man to be a man? It means for a man to be identical with its essence, okay? Because if man is not a man, you cannot make a universal judgment about a man, that all of them have hearts, for example. Because a sophist or a poet or a neo-spiritualist or someone's going to come tell you that, what about a plant? It's so we can see humanity or something of that sort. So by nature, and he uses the word physis, meaning kind, a form of a house of inherent properties. So and also he commences with the word knowledge, which is basically a cornerstone of philosophy. Now, next, an indication in their delight in the senses. For these, quite apart from their utility, are intrinsically delightful, and that through the eyes more than the others. So basically what he's going to talk in the first paragraph is that the delight that men generally get from apprehending things happens through the eye. So he already establishes the prime organ for Western philosophical consciousness structure. And Jean Gebser generally ascribes particular organs to each and every consciousness structure. So, for example, the consciousness structure of the mental is the eye, because eye is an organ that is the most philosophical. Why? Well, first, because eye has the ability to fixate on things. And fixating on things, what it produces is that when you fixate on a particular object, such as a microphone, for example, everything else blurs down. It is being decontextualized from its contextual nexus. And you can apprehend and investigate and dissect its properties on its own. Decontext, and what Heidegger called unworlding it from the context, and what then he will try to reworld and embed back into the contextual framework. So eyes have this faculty of deworlding and fixating, and as we're going to see, that will be the prime precondition for the perspectival Renaissance type of consciousness structure in the in Western civilization. And here then Aristotle says that the sight is the sense that especially produces cognition in us and reveals many distinguishing features of things. And this is the key here, distinguishing features of things. So eye is an organ that distinguishes and differentiates things one from another. And remember what I said in the introduction, the philosophical mode of thought begins with cutting things up, by differentiating things from the mythic and poetic interflow. This is a form of Minecraft, where everything begins to be segmented, and that's why we get all those paradoxes about infinite divisibility, and you not being able to make a step, and so on and so forth, right? What Ian McGilchrist calls the hypertrophy of the left hemisphere, along with the prefrontal lobes. And the distinguishing features of things here is very important, because according to Deleuze, and if you read Plato's Parmenides, difference is the key presupposition that precedes every other transcendental. It precedes law of identity, it precedes all other laws of logic, it precedes every single precondition of knowledge that we possess. Because if the wholeness is not differentiated into its parts, then there is no room for knowledge. Okay? So distinction is a key precondition for any form of philosophical knowledge. And as Jean Gebser describes, magic consciousness structure is characterized by ontological interchangeability, a shamanistic mode of being, whereby everything could be everything else. You can get someone's hair, make a spell on it, and it will affect a real person, because there is no such distinction and differentiation. Now, if you go on and Google the definition of distinction or distinctness, a Merriam-Webster dictionary will give you a circular answer. It is going to tell you, well, it's when things are differentiated, or when things are different from one another, basically presupposing the definition of distinctness in its meaning, right? Because you already have things that are discrete and concrete. And also he speaks about the delight, which already tells you why philosophy is a love of wisdom, because at heart, deep down, a philosophy is irrational, because the innermost affection and love with which you approach knowledge is itself irrational. Okay, so it is, in the first place, it is a delight. Now, next he begins to talk about a form of transcendental prerequisites for knowledge. And he begins by speaking about memory, namely that animals who have memory are above those who do not, because recollecting and forming a memory from your experiences is an absolute and necessary precondition for knowledge. Now, it's absolutely incomplete, but a necessary precondition. And memory is very important here because, and especially not just the long-term memory, but the working memory, because philosophy is impossible without the working memory. Working memory being this ability to fix things in your mind and thinking and dissecting them without some form of impulses and external factors distracting you from it. Now, in the first book, Aristotle basically establishes four principles. We have got learning, unit of experience, knowledge and skill, and wisdom. So, and I'm going to give you the definitions of each and every concept, and then we're going to carry on. So basically, learning is memory plus the ability to hear, which he first ascribes to animals, whereby those animals who also have the ability to hear can learn. Whereas the unit of experience is an act of recollecting one and the same thing for a particular period of time. Now, this is very important because we already have a form of repeatability of the same, right? And the self-sameness and, producing the same, this generally establishes this whole tone about, then you have British empiricism, which speaks about the uniformity of nature and so on and so forth. This self-sameness and recollecting the same. And the recollection here is also important, this word, because it already shows you how ancient Greek philosophers understand the inner workings of the mind, whereby you already have some knowledge stored within a particular domain which you recollect, which you fish for, okay? And then he speaks about how experience, the unit of experience, what constitutes the single experience, namely a recollection of the same thing. Next, we have knowledge and skill, which transcends experience, which is above experience. And a knowledge and skill is produced by thinking about your experience, okay? By generalizing your experience into abstract assumptions about species. For example, making an assumption about the inherent property of a computer, not a particular computer, but computers in general, okay? And here's the distinction, whereby the definition of experience is recollection of the same, whereas the definition of knowledge is thinking about experience, the recollection as opposed to thinking. And the production of knowledge is this abstract thinking, whereby the eye with which he begins his metaphysics transcends into a form of the inner eye, into the mind's eye, okay? And, as he quotes Paulus, experience produces skill, and he equates skill with knowledge, whereas inexperience, chance. Okay, and as we're going to see, Aristotle will defend his project against contingency and chance. He wants to establish rules and laws against the force of chance, contingency, discontinuity, and spontaneity, concepts that dominate poetic mode of being. And lastly, we have wisdom, which we will get to, and the definition of wisdom, according to Aristotle, is a knowledge which has to do with certain principles and causes, okay? And we're going to get to that. Now, Now, he brings up a particular example to differentiate how experience is different from knowledge and how experienced people are different from knowledgeable people. So, for example, you are a doctor and you know that a particular drug is beneficial or is appropriate to the, to Socrates or Celius to treat them, right? But this is a form of experience because you just recollect. You don't actually know. You just recollect from your experience that giving a medicine B to a person Y treats them. Okay, but in that case, you are treating that particular person. You are not treating them by their nature of manliness or by nature of humanness. Okay, so this is a form of experience. Whereas knowing the cause of the illness defined by species or why and how this medicine is beneficial to people and working out this principle from their universal property, namely to understand their human essence, and then understanding how this medicine addresses their problem in context of them being human in the sense of species knowledge. Then it becomes a knowledge as opposed to an experience. And here it's very important to look at what Greek word he is using when speaking about species. And surprisingly, he's using the word eidos, which is basically the word that Plato uses for forms. That, which in modern United States and in modern universities is taught in the sense of, Plato believed in some form of abstract forms that are floating above in some realm. And, these particular objects, participate in those, abstract forms that are, over there transcending our everyday world. And, they are this abstract eidos, the form. However, here, which in Aristotle, which is, and of course, Aristotle is different from Plato, but you see how the word eidos is used in the sense of abstract universal category, a genera, basically, a man in general. Okay, so Aristotle basically downgrades the ontological status of forms, right, into abstract genera, into an abstract universal category. However, in case of Plato, it's also not evident that he actually thinks of those forms as some form of otherworldly things. Actually, in Parmenides, Socrates defines eidos, forms, as thoughts in soul. These are basically the ground paradigms which precede particular things, sensible things, with which sensible things can make sense. It's not some form of outdated theory. Actually, if you go deep down in cognitive science, the theory of forms is pretty relevant. When you like a woman, for example, you don't like her because of her womanness. You like her because you recognize a particular form, eidos, in which she participates. And if you recognize the same form in other substance that is not a woman, you will also feel a sexual attraction. So, for example, imagine a woman with some particular hip to waist ratio, which you find sexually attractive. What is happening actually is that there is a form, eidos, a particular type of fixed scheme that precedes your knowledge of a particular woman, in which you recognize that form. And if you are going to then see someone else who is not a woman but imitates the same form which you recognized in a woman, you are going to feel a sexual attraction, because it is the form which you are attracted to instead of a substance. Substance needs to participate in that particular form, and it's a very effective tool for propaganda. If you generally like athleticism, if you generally like symmetric faces, if you generally like deep voice, if you generally like height, which you recognize in people, what for example, filmmakers are going to do is that they're going to make a character who is going to participate in all of those forms, platonic forms, but he's going to provide some form of political message. But you are going to be convinced, and you are going to believe that because he or she participates in all of those forms that you like. Okay, so but that's a topic for another video. Now let's carry on. Now next he speaks about how practical people and practical people are experienced people. These are people who are concerned with particulars as opposed to general knowledge. How they are more successful and more productive in treating, for example, people when it comes to medicine or when it comes to engineering, because they have an experience of dealing with particular people. On the other hand, a person with a general knowledge, the knowledge of primary causes, a species-wide universal knowledge, will actually be pretty ineffective when it comes to doing practical things, right? And this is an anecdote that has been around, right? You have all those jokes about how when a theoretical physicist comes into a laboratory and everything blows up, and which basically which is already evident in ancient Greece. And here what I want to stress is that basically when Aristotle speaks about a doctor who's experienced, who doesn't have knowledge, when he treats Socrates of his illness, he's not addressing the manliness or the humanity of Socrates, because in that case, that property, the humanness, is accidental. Which this is very important, because accidental, which is and the word that he uses is symbebekos, I think, which means not an inherent property of something. Okay, and then this is already important because you already see a differentiation between the essential properties that belongs to someone, right, which you cannot just alter by poetry or by some form of magic, witchcraft or something, and then you have accidental properties, which do not belong to which do not belong to the essence of a particular species. Now then he goes on to establish that people who have wisdom are above experienced people, because they can actually access wisdom, because these are the people who have answers to why as opposed to what, who can access because as opposed to that. These are the people who know the causes. And then he also makes a distinction between experienced people and actual knowers by saying that people who know should be able to teach, and they are able to articulate their knowledge and pass it down. And this is very important because, and especially in modern world, because we have all those millionaires and all those rich people who are just, computer programmers or who code and who don't have actual knowledge. You can have basically in modern world, what it takes for you to become a PhD in any particular scientific discipline is that you need to be good at math. You need to, in mathematics. You need to be good at practice. They are searching for slaves. They're searching for workers so that they can eat those scholarships and funds and grants. Okay, and if you're going to talk to a typical PhD in something, they have no theoretical knowledge. Well, I had an experience the other day. I was talking to a guy who was writing a PhD in chemistry. He couldn't even explain how ATP works, let alone the other questions that I asked. I had conversations with computer scientists whatever that means. I mean, who just, write programs or applications and they're working as a web developers or whatever, and they boast how they know everything about computers and how it works. I mean, I couldn't find a guy who could explain and articulate what a processor is, okay, what a GPU actually does, or and how, for example, a memory card works. These people have some form of memorized stiff knowledge, which is not knowledge for Aristotle. They're just good for practice. And as Aristotle is going to speak in following chapters, he will basically define the essential property of humans as being slaves. That essentially we are by nature slaves, and it just happened in a particular temporal framework where a particular philosophical type has emerged who began to think unproductively. Okay, and this is the part that we're approaching right now. Now, then he's talking about how designers and theoretical thinkers are more prestigious than craftsmen, because the craftsmen actually don't know what they're doing. They don't know the first principles, and metaphysics is the science of first principles. Also he speaks about so knowledgeable person knows why fire is hot as opposed to that it is hot, and then that's how he differentiates the idea of a philosopher being above the senses, because Aristotle thinks that your senses, although they are good when it comes to apprehending particular objects, they are not good at giving you the whys and the causes. And this is very important, because you are going to then have David Hume, who's going to tell you about how causality is a human intuition. And Aristotle already here tells you that in order for you to see causes, the first principles, you need a mind that is above the five senses, that is going to work out the principles of the why. Okay, so it already tells you that a modern web developer or a modern engineer for Aristotle is just a craftsman who has no idea what he's doing. Okay, because according to Aristotle, if you know something, you need to have the ability to teach it to other people. If you are going to ask a typical physicist who has a PhD, some question about what is matter, what is energy, what is space, or something of that sort, what's going to happen is that he's going to give you some form of word salad, which is sold because there is this general presumption that he says so many alien words, he must know what he's talking about. No, he does not. And completing the book Alpha, then he starts to talk about the history of emergence of such an anthrotype, which is going to be carried on in next chapters. And basically what he says is that at some point in time, when experience is produced out of necessity, some type of thinker emerges who starts to think not because of necessity or because of some kind of practical utility, but just for the sake of thought. And this happens through leisure. And it's very important, because then we're going to have Peter Sloterdijk, who thinks that when the houses and the windows first emerged, and when people started to take strolls and think abstractly, think contemplatively, that's when the first breeding experiments began, whereby those small houses could only arrange people who were self-tamed and small, so that the people could have been domesticated. And the leisure and looking out of the window and looking, which is and seeing and looking here are the words that ancient Greeks use for general thinking, such as nous, logos, theorein, and so on and so forth. This is for Peter Sloterdijk. This was a beginning of breeding projects where particular type of people had to be cancelled out from their breeding experiments, and that's where the self-domestication, self-taming actually began. So Aristotle is pretty adamant that uselessness of knowledge is what defines a first type of contemplative thinker, and that he was above the herd, and that people thought of them as special people because they think for the sake of knowledge, and their knowledge is practically useless. And as we're going to see, Aristotle will define the highest form of knowledge as an unproductive knowledge, which is the most anti-American thing that you can ever say, probably. Right, and lastly, he provides an example that first it happened in ancient Egypt because a priestly caste had, spare time, and that's where the first organized math arose. And then he proceeds to say that theoretical knowledge is above any form of practical endeavor, and he ends by saying that wisdom is basically a knowledge which has to do with certain principles and causes. So this is the first book, and I think that this type of interaction where you're going to ask some questions and criticize me for misreading or misunderstanding Aristotle will help me and will help you in better understanding what is actually going on, because as we're going to find out, the books that are getting dusty in archives, such as works of Plato, Aristotle, ancient Greeks, lots of Western thinkers whose existence we're not aware of because of a particular propaganda. Those are the works that are being actually used quite extensively in modern day politics. So I encourage you to become a Patreon, because I will upload another courses that are going to be more dangerous on my Patreon page. And right now I will continue in process Friedrich Nietzsche's Antichrist. So stay tuned, and thanks for your attention.